think there's like a moment when you spend a lot of time with someone, and I don't feel this way with most of my friends, where you're like, oh, like we could do something together.
Conflict is one of the highest forms of intimacy, right? It's like allowing yourself to become not necessarily the worst version of yourself, but definitely a version that we're not very well conditioned to share with other people.
Because therapy and these tools are really important for your work, because what you realize is that we're still human when we go to work. And this was what worked for us. This is how we figured it out.
Welcome to How I Met My Co-Founder, the podcast where entrepreneurs share raw stories behind how their founding teams met, built trust, and navigated conflict. In a world where 65% of startups fail due to relationships between co-founders, it is undeniable that startup success begins with strong partnerships. I'm your host and team relationship expert, Annie Garofalo, and here's your all-access pass into the conversations that can make or break a founding team. Today, we're joined by 2/3 of the BuildBetter founding team, CEO Spencer Shulem and CTO Nikhil Shinday. Chief Product Officer Adam Stanford isn't able to join us today, but his name will echo through our discussion. 3 years ago, Spencer and Adam started BuildBetter as their second startup together. Spencer then brought on his childhood friend Nikhil as a third co-founder, and since then, they've seen great success, making thousands of product teams more efficient and securing funding from leading investors like Telegraph Hill Capital, Wing, Surface, and Village Global. But that's all the business stats and product information you'll get from us today. Our conversation with Spencer and Nikhil focuses exclusively on their founding team relationship. How did trust and respect evolve? Who owns what in the company? What's the essence of being a co-founder? And of course, what are the juiciest conflicts and how are they resolved? Thanks for being here, Spencer and Nikhil. Spencer, will you take us back 3 years and share more about how your team came together?
So effectively, me and Adam had worked at my last company together. He was, I want to say, the first person I kind of brought in with me, and very much had like a co-founder relationship the entire time at that company. And I loved working with him. And I think we got along really well. And by the end of it, it was literally co-founders. Like it was an equal equity split and everything like that. And I think when you have someone that you love working with, you're like, well, we should work again together. Nikhil was actually at another startup in another company. I've known Nikhil since I was a kid, but I loved him. Like I was his, but he was my best friend. I don't know about him, but I spent a lot of my time with Nikhil growing up in the family, the Shinday family. So that was kind of like the start of how I met both these two people. One of them was at my previous company, and the other one I grew up with as a kid. And then I reconnected with Nikhil when I moved to San Francisco, and he was working on his first YC company. And during that time, I was like, dude, at some point, whenever you're done with your escapades of other YC founder companies, I'd love to work with you. Like, we should totally work together. And I don't even know, Nikhil, if you were positive with that response, or you gave me the kind of, yeah, sure. Like,
Right. Yeah, totally.
But I think there's like a moment when you spend a lot of time with someone, and I don't feel this way with most of my friends, where you're like, oh, like we could do something together and the sum of the individual parts would be greater. And so that was kind of just in the air. And then Nikhil, kind of towards the end of his time at his last company, we had picked an idea. Me and Adam were like brainstorming around this whole area of product research and building something for founders and early stage product teams. And we feel like if we had someone like Nikhil, we could really, turn this into something great. So we, again, very, very early on, we're like, we need someone else. Like we would love to have someone else. And Nikhil was still at his other company. And we had to do a little bit of magic of convincing him to hop ship sooner than later. But that was kind of it. Was obviously like a very long tenure of how we initially met.
It sounds like you also have a history of balancing the professional and the personal life, but you were doing it early on in high school. Nikhil, I'm curious from your perspective, what did it take for you to join BuildBetter? Like what convinced you, brought you on, especially in those early days?
Logistically, like I was working at a company that my friend had started. I was a founding engineer, and the company just wasn't positioned to succeed. And Spencer very rightly pointed out, like just the circumstance that I was in at the time, and I think like it was a wake up call to me, and that definitely pushed me over. But I think less logistically and more big brained. One, I think like the familiarity of working with somebody that you've known for 20 years just seemed like super fun and super interesting, right? Like Spencer and I have like a sibling like relationship, and I think we sometimes bicker, like probably worse than a lot of siblings. So, yeah,
we have a safe word at the company when Nikhil and I bicker, so that people can call us out.
Call it out. Yeah, we haven't had to use it in like 6 months though. That's pretty good.
Yeah, it's been a long time. We've done a good job.
Yeah, so I think just like the ability to have continuity of intimacy between like personal and professional lives was really interesting to me. And then also like truth be told, like we all decided to work as a founding team after one-on-one call between me and Adam. Yeah, I think I just really jived with Adam on that, and I hadn't realized that Spencer would be that counterbalance, which I'm in retrospect very grateful for.
One thing that Nikhil kind of highlights, and I think maybe like the essence of what Nikhil felt at the start, and I think what we all felt, was a level of respect. And I think we've never lost respect for each other throughout the entire process. And I think that was the thing that we needed on day one, was like, do we respect each other? Do we respect each other's intelligence, our abilities, our differences within this job, the reason why we're here? And I think it was very obvious early on that like the answer was yes.
Yeah. And I think that gets to, I think about a healthy co-founding relationship as not just complementary in the functional sense, like with skill sets, but there's also these other levels of social and emotional complementarity and balance that both of you touched on, which brings me to a question on thinking back to when, Nikhil, you were brought on to the company. It sounds like Spencer and Adam had spent a little bit of time working together on previous ideas and on this idea, and we're thinking to bring in a third co-founder, but they had this existing partnership. So I'm curious, for teams who are going through that now, maybe it's a team of two looking to bring on a third co-founder, what best practices do you feel like you employed in that process and helped to create a more equitable trio as you joined that team?
Yeah, I can speak to my own circumstance, which is of knowing one of the co-founders ahead of time and not knowing the other one as well. I think it's a completely different dynamic when you're two co-founders who have worked with each other for a while, and then you're trying to bring on a third who neither of you know. But in my circumstance, I think the most helpful thing has been cultivating an individual relationship with Adam, the co-founder that I didn't know as well. It was hard for a while to get into conflict with him. And I think that conflict is one of the highest forms of intimacy, right? It's sort of like allowing yourself to become not necessarily the worst version of yourself, but definitely a version that you don't like, that in our society, we're not like very well conditioned to share with other people. And I think a lot of the work with Adam has been like getting him to trust me enough that he can like say, yo, that's shit, like that work was shit. And now like there's a joke which is like, half the time like now we're both kind of in the place of like saying, hey, that's shit, and like we should just burn it down, like just delete the code base. And like the other half like we'll say like, hey, that's shit, and we should like try and fix it, or here are the things that we can like try to do. So I think like I had to earn the trust from Adam that he could criticize me and I would receive it well. I think the general statement or the general form of that is you need to understand like people's tender spots. And I think these are the ones that like supersede interpersonal and professional boundaries, and like circumstances. And you need to like work to make sure that you can like have mutual understanding of those tender spots so that you can like work well with them.
Yeah. And one particular thing about understanding each other's tender spots, that there's a principle in couples therapy that's called love mapping. And it really is just understanding the other person and
Mm.
other people in that relationship, and understanding kind of their maps and like what to avoid, what to be transparent about, or not avoid necessarily, I guess, more have more compassion around when you bring it up, and knowing
Be tender towards.
be
Yeah,
tender
exactly.
towards. Exactly. And so by having that
Yeah.
map, and you can even think about it as like an actual map, you can better chart the paths of conversations and how to get from point A to point B. And I think that's very true within
Yeah.
founders as well. And there's a lot on the line there. So I think that was a really beautiful summation of a technique that's thought about that way in couples therapy. And then also there's this other principle called the sound relationship house. And the two weight-bearing walls of a healthy relationship are trust and commitment. And so it makes sense that a lot of the work that
Mhm.
you and Adam were doing together was building those walls, was building that trust and commitment. You knew it was there with Spencer. And so building that, and it takes time and a lot of conversation. And it sounds like you've gotten there over the past 2-3 years, but it's a long journey. Which brings me to a question on, what is a co-founder to you? How do you think about who that person is and what they bring, not only to the company, but also to this trio? This, like, you're making these big decisions, you're building something new. Like, what do you think the co-founder role really means?
I've always felt like the definition for me of a co-founder is someone who doesn't, it's not a job title. It's not like a specific description of their roles. I really think that it's the responsibility that the person gets to have within the organization. And I think responsibility is like the responsibility of the outcome, the responsibility of the people, the responsibility of a specific part of the company. I think it's really the ownership that I think comes in and out of the role of responsibilities for founders. But I think for us, it was really like this division and the respect that we have in each one of these divisions. We completely void ourselves of responsibility for the specific outcomes that that person's responsible for. For example, sales and marketing, Nikhil and Adam, if I want their opinion, if I have a question, like they'll come to me and or I'll come to them and I'll ask them a question. But ultimately, it's on me and it's my job and it's my responsibility for those outcomes. And obviously, I shouldn't do whatever I want, but it's my job to work with them and say, you guys can be my sounding board for this specific thing. And the same thing goes for Nikhil and Adam for their specific roles. They'll often come to the table and say, here's what I'm thinking through. Here's the problems. Do you guys agree or disagree? And help me think through this thing. But ultimately, it's their failure. It's their success.
Yeah. I think of principal components. I don't know if you took linear algebra, but like the idea of like you have in some dimensional space, you have like arrows that point in like completely orthogonal directions. And like for whatever problem that you're planning on solving as a company, having co-founders that sort of are interested in and intrinsically motivated in solving very different problems is really, really helpful. And I should say different domains of problems while still being interested in like the actual customer problem that you as a company are trying to solve. I think that just gives you a lot more flexibility with what you can do, because it's like much more likely that somebody's going to be wanting to do whatever it is. And then there's also less friction because it's clear who picks it up.
And I think that's a common trait of really successful teams, is the clarity in what domain each individual is owning. So it's clear what value they bring. It's clear to themselves and to the rest of the team. I also think it helps with respect, Spencer, like you were saying earlier. I'm curious, how did you change? How did you determine your roles up front, and did those change over time, or have they been set from the get-go?
From my first person experience, and maybe Spencer might disagree with this, but I feel like the roles were implicit to start, but then as time went on, we realized that there was a need for that. And so I wouldn't say that they changed as much as they evolved or became more discrete and concrete. Like if you were to put words to the implicit, in my head, like a co-founder relationship was something where like everybody just jumps at the problem with whatever they can if they see it. And I think I've learned that that's I wouldn't say dysfunctional, but definitely less effective. So Adam deals with like, he's the one non-ADHD founder. So he's the one that's like doing project management and making sure, like, just keeping us accountable and making sure that we're focused. Obviously, we sometimes help, and we can hit other people with the focus stick as well. But it's definitely mostly him. We have this meme of Pepe the Frog. That's Adam's Slack image because he has the whip, and he's like, just like the House of Representatives, he's the whip, and he marshals people and makes sure that they're like doing what they need to do. Maybe you can cut out the part about the whip.
I like that because it brings to life, like, it shows how clear your roles are, right? Like, so much so that it's someone's emoji on Slack and it's communicated to the whole company. So I like that as an anecdote, and I think as a lesson, it's like the clarity goes beyond just the three of you. It also extends to the company and how you think about your different roles.
Oh, absolutely.
I think that to your question, though, about like how have roles maybe potentially changed over the course of 2.5, 3 years or so, I would say the biggest change has just come out organically as the organization has evolved, as we've hired people, as we've let people go, as people have left. We've kind of changed the dynamics of the organization just based off the needs. So oftentimes we might hire someone who just needs something different. And so when it's just the three of us, the lines were not very clear, and they didn't need to be because no one had any questions about the lines. If you hire an engineer, who does that engineer report to? Who's ultimately the person who's going to let them go, or who's going to be critical of their performance, and vice versa. And so we've always tried to make it very clear whenever something changes that this is the change and this is how it's going to affect people, and here's how you can deal with this. So there's, I think, very clear lines, even at the early stages. So there's no ambiguity. There's no question about who's responsible for this thing. There's no, oh, well, you told me this, or I thought this was supposed to be done on Friday. Well, that was your job. That was like your responsibility. I do think the roles will continue to change. Like, I think if you talk to us in 5 years from now, we could see the roles very different, and even different people moving around and shuffling around. We're really just constantly trying to optimize with who's going to do this the best and who's going to actually enjoy doing this for the longest period of time.
Yeah. And I think that's such a beautiful balance between clarity and like execution, as well as being flexible and evolving with the organization and with the person. I'm curious, when do those conversations happen? Because as founders and people building a startup, it's so busy. Things are just moving really quickly. How do you take the time to actually have those conversations?
Right before you ask that question, that's exactly what I was thinking of, is like, we're really lucky to have that space for it. I think early on, a lot of it happened almost exclusively in these like co-founder plus executive coach calls. We all have the same executive coach. So we would all see him one-on-one, and we've all kind of opted into this like pseudo confidentiality where he doesn't talk about specific things from other people's sessions, but he can use context from other people in each other's sessions. We also see him together once a month. And I think early on, a lot of those conversations ended up happening there. And I think it was indicative of a little bit of dysfunction that we had as a team, just like a lack of understanding of each other and the charges that each of us hold, and each other's like sort of emotional patterns. But as time has gone on, increasingly those have just happened with the three of us. Some of them, sometimes it's ad hoc. We have a once a week check-in with each other after we do our like company-wide check-in on Fridays, where we just chat about this stuff.
That's amazing. What was most helpful, I guess, about bringing in kind of an external person to help navigate that dysfunction, especially in the early days? What was particularly beneficial about that?
So I had this person as my kind of coach. I've been in therapy since I was like 8 years old. And so I was very lucky to have parents who believed in therapy and who were able to kind of put me in that situation. I've always kind of had someone in that role in my life. And so when I became professional in my career and being a founder, your role is very different. Like, your career is very different. And oftentimes therapy itself, their goal is to normalize you, to bring you to a median. And that's not great. And coaches often are the exact opposite. They're trying to amplify you. And that's also not great. So there's like this balance that I was looking for, which is I needed someone who could understand the normality, the professionalism of a therapist, while also not trying to pull me down, not trying to pull us down, not trying to normalize us to a mean of saying, "Oh, you should work less. Oh, it sounds like you're really stressed. Have you thought about finding a new career?" Like, these types of solutions that often therapists might have, because that's not what a founder is. Like, we signed up for this. Like, that's what we're trying. Like, don't try and bring me down. But at the same time, like, I also don't want to be amped up and filled up with gas and being told things that aren't true, or whatever it might be. And I think those are on the tail ends of both good and bad therapy and good and bad coaching. So I found this person and I was working with him for like 6 months. He kind of pitched the idea of like, yo, because I kept talking more about like my founder relationships, and Nikhil and Adam. And he was like, yo, like, I feel like if I talk to them, it would be really good. And so that was the start of it. And I didn't know how it was going to go. And Nikhil has his own therapy and his own coaches on his own side. I think Adam was in the camp of this is not in my like realm of things that I enjoy doing or want to be doing. And so I told both of them, talk to this guy for one session, like on the house, like through the company. And if it works and you like him, we can keep talking to him. And if not, we can stop. Like, no pressure, no forced obligation. And I think it became very apparent early on that it was not just helpful from a company standpoint, where we were now able to have someone who could not be an intermediary between us, but allow us to empathize from the context of understanding someone else's perspective more concretely, but also because therapy and these tools are really important for your work, because what you realize is that we're still human when we go to work. We don't all of a sudden become this like autonomous robot that gets things done. And I think what we learn through this process is that so much of the problems that we have with each other are problems that we have with ourselves that we're still dealing with and we're still processing, we're still working on. And when we try and separate those two things, we have a really difficult time solving them. And so I think when we just did therapy outside of work and we just did coaching inside of the company, it became difficult for us to balance kind of these different voices that were pulling us in different directions. And our coach was able to kind of pull us into a more singular narrative of we're all going towards the same thing, and how do we work with each other's problems and each other's differences and all this kind of stuff to find a more holistic way of looking at our relationship. And I will say, I think it's brought us closer as friends more than founders, if anything. I think you're spending your life with these people more time than you would with your partner. You're spending 10 plus years longer than an average marriage, and you're expected to not understand them, right? Like, not empathize with them, not understand what's going on in their life. And so I think so much of the value that we've gotten from having a group kind of coach as well as individuals with the same person is we get to basically learn enough about each other that we can have a productive friendship with each other as well as a productive relationship in work.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And one of the leading causes of failure of startups is co-founder conflict. And I think in large part because there's not that communication that's happening, that holistic communication and focus on interpersonal dynamics. People start to think my co-founder is just a functional complement. But again, as we were saying, there's so much more to that. There's the functional, there's the social, there's the emotional, and all of those need their own investment and to think about it holistically in order to build a successful company. Especially as founders, that role is particularly full of rejection and uncertainty and loneliness, and figuring out how you're going to get through that as a group and come out on the other side, not just at neutral, but at making something bigger than the sum of its parts is a journey. And takes a lot of those big conversations and hard conversations. And it makes a ton of sense to bring in a third party to help think about that and orient to what that process looks like for you.
I think oftentimes people say they're lonely as founder. I think you're not lonely because you're alone. I think you're lonely because you don't feel seen. And I think oftentimes within this role, even with multiple co-founders, you can still feel lonely. It is not solved by having more people around you. I mean, you can't, there's plenty of stories of people going to parties and still feeling alone. And the same thing's true with being a founder. I think the goal is that I haven't felt lonely in a while at this company because I feel seen by the people that I'm working with. And that is not intuitive. Like that does not come without work from everyone here to put in that time to make sure that we're seeing what the other person needs to be seen.
Yeah, there's that commitment that's there to put in the work and be that emotional support. And that's not always the setup for, there's founding teams that are successful where that's not the case, but being aligned that in your case, in this team, being an emotional support is a commitment that you're making as a co-founder, and that's how you tick.
There's functional marriages. There's marriages for land. There's marriages for wealth. There's marriages for outcomes. There's a lot of different types of marriages. So yeah, this is the marriage that works for us. These are the rules that we've kind of set that make sense for us. And I think it really is like that. Like every marriage is different, and every marriage, like there's boundaries and there's things that people feel comfortable with and things that people don't feel comfortable with. And this was what worked for us. Like this is how we figured it out.
Yep. And one of the most important things in a founding team relationship is that social contracting and figuring out what the commitments we're making to each other are and having time and space to talk about that pretty early on as well.
Yeah.
Yeah. I have a question
Absolutely.
that I think listeners are going to be curious about, probably stemming back from when the two of you said that you bicker and have a safe word at work. And I'm curious if you would unpack a disagreement with us. Like, what does that look like? And get pretty tactical if you're open to it. What does that look like? How do the three of you typically show up in those conversations? And what makes the culture? Each of you have such specific domain expertise, which can be really complementary. And also, I'm sure, can lead to tension. So how do you navigate when those things are in tension? And if you could bring an example to light for us, I'm sure the listeners would appreciate.
We had a big one a few months ago about our back end, some decisions that we made on our back end. Well, from a high level, there was a disagreement in strategy, which was, do we want to kind of simplify and spend a lot of time simplifying our back end, or do we mind keeping it maybe a little bit more complex in the state that it's in and solve just some of the more tactical problems that need to be addressed? And that was probably like the most heated thing that I wasn't even really involved in. It was between like Adam and Nikhil kind of going back and forth. And I think that was like a very difficult decision because it affected everyone. And it was also Nikhil's responsibility. So it was like one person ultimately got to make the decision, ultimately got to have the power over the outcomes and the decision. And it was also everyone kind of had to work with around Nikhil on either, fighting our case for what we wanted, helping understand kind of the scope of the problems that we're having with the current system. And so there was a lot of difficulty in navigating that.
That's so funny because I don't think of that as like a big conflict at all.
That was probably the problem, right?
maybe. Okay, so I guess the way that I see, I definitely see it as a conflict, and maybe that is the biggest conflict that we've had in recent memory. It was like 2 months ago, 3 months ago. But I don't see it as like one of the bigger ones in the scope of BuildBetter. I think the thing that was novel about it was that it was not a conflict between me and Spencer, but a conflict between me and Adam. And
between
specifically,
front end,
yeah. Specifically, what we were trying to decide, again, without revealing too much, was like, do we want to like keep our front end and back end decoupled, or do we want to make them like very coupled together? And there were a bunch of trade-offs, but I think the thing that ultimately resolved the problem was coming with the problem and not the solution. So the pattern was Spence. I think all of us had seen all of us knew the problem. All of us saw the problem, which was like, it's really hard for people that have like traditionally been front end engineers to go into the back end code base right now. It's kind of incomprehensible. There's like, it's wired in weird ways. It's like kind of chaotic, which is just like a good representation of my general mental state most of the time. but like it makes sense to me. So, no, and I've been the one that's worked on it the past 2 years. So that's just how it evolved. Obviously, since other people wanted to, or since we realized that that was a bottleneck and that other people needed to start working on the back end in addition to the front end, we needed to make some decision or some architectural decisions. And I think the pattern was that we were all in agreement about that needed to happen. And Adam kept on coming to me with solutions. So like, oh, let's just move to Next.js, and or like, hey, like, maybe we can do some like hosted, like some easier infrastructure stuff. And I kept on rejecting those. And at some point, Adam, like, I think the most rageful that I've seen Adam is basically saying on Slack, after me like shooting down an idea of his, you know what, I'm trying to help you right now, and like it sounds like you just want to stick to the current system, so let's do that. And I was like, no, you're not getting away with it so quickly. Like, you're coming to me with a solution. I want to know what the problem is underlying that solution, and like why you're reaching for that solution rather than like any of the hundreds of other dev tools that we have available to us as like devs in 2023. And after clearly defining the problem, we both thought about it for a little bit. And actually, it didn't take that long. It was like an hour on a one-on-one the Monday after, that message was sent on a Sunday or something. And we came to a conclusion like, okay, here are the problems. Here's like the most efficient way to get the outcome that we want. It's not necessarily these tools, but there are ways that we can evolve like our existing infrastructure to like get what we need, and then we can move the fuck on. And we did that, and it worked. So I think like a lot of the time in conflict, the underlying assumptions of what the conflict are about, like once those are clarified and once those are made like, made apparent to everybody in the conversation, then like they're really easy to move through. Up until that point, it's often painful. And I think that's just true of all conflict, even in relationships and friendships.
Yeah, I think the founder relationship as well is we don't want to be told what to do. We want to be like brought along the journey. I, as a product person myself and my background, this is the hardest thing sometimes. Like you listen to a customer and they tell you like, oh my God, this is a huge problem. And then I'm like, fuck, we should just solve this thing. We should do this. Like, this is the thing to do. And that's when it almost always gets rejected. I can guarantee you, if I bring something to Nikhil or Adam and say, a customer said this and we should do that, I think it's on each one of us to bring the other person through the journey, through the thought process. And even when it comes to fundraising, hiring, all these kinds of things, the same thing. They hate if I bring them someone and say, we should hire this person's great, do this thing. We think about, okay, like what's the problem that we're trying to solve? Help me think through the process of why we should hire this person. And I think all of us particularly are very good at being objective.
Yeah. And also implicit in becoming a founder, it's you could do and make money in any number of more secure, less risky ways. And a lot of people choose to found because they want to have a say over what's being built and what's being done. And so it makes sense that in a team of three, you want that kind of level of respect happening across the three of you and feeling like even if it's someone else's decision and they're owning that they're bringing you along in the process. And so that makes a lot of sense given the motivations and
100%.
what it takes to be a founder.
Simultaneously, I feel like oftentimes people can interpret what like everything of what we just said as like everybody needs to be in alignment and everybody needs to agree on it, like on what we're doing. And I think something that we hold really strongly is like disagreeing and committing. And I think that means a very specific thing for us, which isn't just I disagree with what we're planning on doing, like you should go ahead and do it. It's like the commitment and disagreement is to try and make the outcome work as much as you possibly can, even though you disagree with the way that you're approaching it. I think we are much more aligned as a team because we can put each other through, like we can show each other the steps that we come to, like we are trying to take to get to an outcome, and we can resolve conflicts very easily that way. But ultimately, if like you still disagree, like even when knowing like what the intrinsic problem is, and like you have two different paths to get to some solution or to some resolution, we have to choose one, and one person has to submit and say, okay, we're doing it this way. And I think it's impossible to have like a healthy culture without that,
especially having that defined and being upfront about it and saying, yep, even if I disagree with the decision that's made, I agree with the process and how we got here, and I will do everything in my power to make this work on behalf of the company. To wrap up, what advice would you give aspiring founders, especially in terms of building and sustaining long-term founding partnerships?
Top of mind for me is, I always say this a lot to Nikhil and Adam, which is like, it is more important for us to enjoy our time together than it is for the outcome to be forced. And I think we really try and respect each other as people, as friends, not as objects to solve problems per se. And I do think that when you focus on that, I do think you actually get better solutions and better outcomes and more dedication from the people that you work with. And I think like that often gets missed with most founders, is it's like a marriage of convenience, which often does not last very long.
Similar vein, play games with people that want to play long-term games. It's, obviously all of us want BuildBetter to be an outlier success, but if it isn't, we all want to work together again. And I think there's like no question of that. There's this like approach in Theravada Buddhism to awakening, which is like basically to cultivate like the ability to generate pleasure like in your body and in your mind, like at will. And you do that not because that is awakening, but because that allows you to settle your mind and your body enough that you can awaken. And it allows you to like stop doing the things in your life that like aren't helpful, like are sort of working against awakening. And I think the same way, if you show up every day and you enjoy your work and like it's good vibes, like you're almost bound to be successful if you just continue to do it for long enough.
Yeah.
I love that. Big thank you to the two of you for joining us. Really excited to see BuildBetter continue to grow, and just really appreciate your insights today. Thanks, Spencer and Nikhil.
Thank you
Thanks,
so
Annie.
much. I appreciate your time.
That was Spencer Shulem and Nikhil Shinday, co-founders of BuildBetter. If you'd like to learn more about their company and how your product team can save 2 weeks in 2 minutes, stay tuned for a word from them directly, or check them out at buildbetter.ai. Hey, thanks for listening to the show this week. Please make sure to click the follow button on your podcast app so you never miss an episode of the show. Do you have a burning question you'd like answered? If so, you're in luck. We'll be concluding this season with an Ask Annie Anything. Submit questions at confidant, confidante.info/podcast or email podcast@confidant.info. As this is our first season, please share any feedback and thoughts as well. I'm Annie Garofalo, and thank you for listening to How I Met My Co-Founder.